friends and neighbors, Jerry Rosa here in the Rosa Stringworks workshop. And for something a little different today, I've been wanting to make a video for quite a long time, really for several months, about how to improve the sound of your instruments. Well, Randy Schardiger, a friend of mine on YouTube, kind of beat me to the punch. But that also prompted me to go ahead and get started on mine, and he did a good job on his, and I'll put a link to his video in the whatchamadiddle down below. And I also received an email from another YouTube friend. His name is Jeff Bradshaw at elderlyiron.com. He has a YouTube channel which it's Redneck Restorations, This Old Truck. And I'll put a link to his channel in the whatchamadiddle as well. He also sent me in the email a video link, and I'll put a link to it as well, about Paul Reed Smith doing a presentation at TEDx Mid-Atlantic. And it was a very good presentation. I think you should watch it for sure if you want to learn how to improve the sound of your instruments and at least learn more about the theory about it. And basically his theory, and I'll just kind of surmise it, and then we'll use pieces of that theory as we talk here today, because I agree with him 100%. His theory is a subtractive theory. Okay, and if you'll play with me for just a minute here and play along with me and just follow along and try to imagine what I'm talking about here. Let's just imagine that you have the perfect instrument. It was created by God, or it was created by the little pixies that sneak into your workshop at night, and when you got there in the morning it was laying on your table and it was a perfect instrument. Now that means that it is absolutely perfect, and by definition that means you can't improve upon it. It's perfect. It's got the perfect strings, it's got the perfect sound, it's got the perfect resonance. Everything about it is perfect. Well, with that subtractive theory, basically what that's saying is, from that point on, everything you do to it is going to subtract from it. In other words, when you play it, it's actually going to subtract from it. Now let's say you're a perfect player, which I've never seen or heard of, but let's just assume that you're a perfect player. Well then, I guess if you have a perfect instrument and you're a perfect player, well then you're not really subtracting, you're going to be just kind of even with the board. But that mandolin or that guitar or that violin, if it's perfect, it's absolutely as good as it could ever be. And then from that point forward, everything you do to that instrument takes away from it. Now, of course, this is an imaginary scenario. And what I mean by take away from it means that, like, if you change the strings on it, remember it had perfect strings, so you change the strings, now it's not perfect anymore. You're degrading it a little bit. Put a different kind of strings on it, you might be degrading it even more. Put a different saddle or a different nut on it, you're going to degrade the sound a little bit more, because it was perfect, remember? Okay, well, if you kind of follow along with my scenario there, and that's really a kind of a very broad, rough, kind of a summary of what you'll see in the Paul Reed Smith video. He does a very good job, and I think you should watch it. But that's kind of my take on what he's saying. Well, let's bring that down to the real world, okay? And let's just say that you've got a mandolin, or you've got a D35 Martin guitar, or a violin, a Stradivarius violin, and it's as good as any you've ever heard. So like, now we're just talking practical terms. Okay, it's a Martin D35, let's just use that one as an example. And it's as good a D35 as you have ever heard. You own it, you love it, and when it's set up right, it's as good as it gets. Okay, well, can you improve upon it? Well, yeah, in a way you can, but if you think about the theory that Paul Reed Smith is putting out there, basically you're going to subtract less from it. You're not really improving upon it because it's as good as it can be. It was built as good as it can be built, and it sounds as good as it can sound, but you can subtract less perhaps. For instance, the type of strings you use on it. Maybe the strings it came from the factory with are very good, but maybe they're not as good as you could get, and perhaps that would subtract less if you put better strings on it. Or if you had a better bridge or a better saddle or a better nut, or, you know, just on and on and on. Okay, so you're starting to see, I hope, where I'm coming from here. Well, that's what I'm going to talk about on this whole presentation, and I'm going to be talking about multiple instruments. I'm going to be talking about mandolins, violins, guitars primarily, but you can take almost everything I say and push them out to other instruments, like, I mean, even a dulcimer or a banjo or a dobro or those kinds of things. I will hit on I've got about a dozen talking points in front of me here. I don't have a script. I'm just going to talk ad lib, and this could be a very long video, but I'll try to edit it down to where it makes some sense and that we get off on the very important points. Well, first of all, on an instrument, obviously it's got to be good wood. Now, we could argue all day long, and we would never resolve what the best woods are. You know, to every person, you know, it's to their ear what sounds the best to them. But in terms of, you know, in terms of acoustic instruments now, and by the way, I'm not really going to be addressing electric instruments. I'm not the expert in electric. But in terms of acoustic instruments, you've got a number of choices for top woods and as opposed to backwoods, back and side woods. And then a third choice would be the neck woods. And, you know, should they be different? Should they all be the same? Well, you know, again, we'll never resolve that completely because everybody's going to have a little bit different opinion on that. But I will give you some words of wisdom that I've learned and have put to the test over the years. For the top boards, you know, your standard top board, if you will, it would be some sort of a spruce. I personally prefer the old Adirondack red spruce. That's what they used on the pre-war Martin guitars and the pre-war Gibsons and things like that. It's a little harder to come by these days. But other spruces are very good too. Engelmann spruce, Sitka spruce, you know, there's lots of very good spruces out there. One of the more important factors is how that spruce is cut. And if you look at the top of your instrument, and if you see what I refer to as cross-checking going across the grain and on that spruce, well then you know pretty well, without a doubt, that you're very quarter sawed. In other words, it's just basically, if you don't know what quarter sawed is, you might want to look that up, but basically quarter sawed would be if you took a piece of firewood and you split it, and you split it, and you split it, and you split it, kind of like pie wedges coming out of it. That would be quarter sawed. In other words, the grain rings, the growth rings would be going perpendicular, or it's hard to explain that exactly, but the growth rings would be cutting directly through the piece of wood. Instead of slab sawing it, which is where you would lay the log down and just keep sawing boards off of it, that would be called slab sawing. But when you split it vertically like that, then then you open that up and you have book matched sides. The grain matches perfectly. And in other words, the fine grain runs the length of the top rather than the flat plain sawed grain that would run across it. Well, anyway, about that, those fine grains and about the cross-checking, what's important there is how narrow are those grains. You know, there's two schools of thought on this. One is if those growth rings or growth lines are very, very tight and very close together, then the sound will transfer faster across the top. The other school of thought is that if they're a little bit wider, then you have more soft material between those rings, and that softer material gives you a softer sound or a more mellow sound. So there's a lot of, you know, good and pros and cons. Personally, I kind of like to split it in the middle. I don't like them real wide, and I don't like them incredibly tight either. I like them somewhere, I'm going to say 1/16 of an inch wide is really good, or maybe just a hair wider than that. And that'll give you some really, you know, some things to look for when you're buying an instrument, especially that cross-checking. That tells you that it is perfectly quarter sawed. If you don't see the cross-checking in there, doesn't mean it's not quarter sawed, but it's, you know, possibly not sawed perfectly vertical. It could be just slightly at an angle, you know, without that cross-checking. So that'll give you one way of kind of telling whether or not the top is very well quarter sawed. And the quarter sawing also gives it more strength, and that's a good thing because there's a lot of pressure on the top. Okay, in terms of the backwood, well, you know, we could go on forever about that. You know, generally speaking, you want it quarter sawed also, but slightly slab sawed is not too bad for back and sides. The theory is that the softer wood on the top gives you that mellow sound, and the very hard wood on the back bounces the sound back out the sound hole. In other words, it's kind of like dropping a quarter on a piece of carpet or dropping that quarter on a piece of concrete. You're going to hear it on the concrete. You're not going to hear it on the carpet. So you want your soft wood on the top for that mellow sound of transferring that metal string sound through that wood and giving you that woody tone, and then bouncing that woody tone off that hard back. So a good hard wood is preferred over a softer wood. My preference is always something like on a guitar, for instance. My preference, personal preference, is rosewood versus mahogany. Now, I'm not saying you can't get a good sounding mahogany guitar, because I've heard plenty of them and they sound awesome. But it's just my personal preference. I prefer that kind of a little bit punchier, brighter sound that you get with the rosewood. And, you know, combined with that real good woody sound, I think that gives you a real great blend. That's my personal preference. Now, everybody will have a different personal preference on that, and I'm not even about to try to argue that. In terms of the back, you know, whatever kind of wood, you know, it just needs to be a good hard wood. You know, you wouldn't want to put spruce on the back and sides of an instrument. Okay, and in terms of the top again, back to the top, there's different, besides spruce being the standard, there are other top options that I think are very good. One of the very best is Western cedar. Quarter sawed Western cedar makes an awesome sounding top. I've built mandolins out of it, I've built guitars out of it, and they sound great. Believe it or not, redwood makes a very good top. I made a mandolin with a redwood top. I still own it. As a matter of fact, it's my backup mandolin. And I would say it's one of the loudest mandolins I've ever heard. And it has a redwood top. And that wouldn't be something you would ordinarily think, but it's a very loud mandolin. Okay, well, that's enough said about the woods. I don't expect in just a little bit of time to be able to tell you everything we know about woods and the choices, but when you're selecting a good instrument, you know, a good hardwood on the back and a good softwood on the top that is very well quarter sawed will give you your best results. Of course, you don't want plywood, obviously. That goes without saying. You know, I mean, if you can afford it, you want solid wood. If you have to go with a plywood, at least try to get a solid wood on your top. Okay, going on to some things that are more practical would be the strings, the type of strings you use. I used to sell strings, thus Rosa String Works. I used to sell a lot of strings back in the 80s, and I kind of got out of the business just because of, you know, well, actually eBay was one of the reasons, and, you know, buying online, it's hard to compete anymore. So I just got out of that business. It wasn't much of a profit margin, but I learned a lot about strings. And you know, you probably know that some people can't wear certain metals as jewelry because their skin reacts to them. Well, that's the same way with your strings. Some people, you know, regular bronze will go flat on them immediately. I'm one of those. Some people, nickel will go flat on them. Some people, you know, phosphor bronze will go flat on them. So you really have to experiment around and find out what kind of metal works the best with your chemistry. For my money, and for most people, I would say, like, and I'm talking in the 90 percentile, I would say you do well if you stick with phosphor bronze on your strings. Phosphor bronze is a very good metal. It lasts a long time. It sounds real good. Regular bronze sounds pretty good when it's brand new, but it goes dead really fast, in my opinion. Another string, like if you have a thin sounding mandolin that you want to make sound deeper and have more mellow tone to it, try silken steel. You would be amazed at how that can really change an instrument and take the harshness out of the instrument. The silken steel strings, made by GHS, I believe I'm going off the top of my head, I think it's an LS250, I believe is the set number. For a mandolin especially would be a real good choice, it would be the silken steel. It could also work very good on a guitar if you have a kind of a thin sounding guitar. It would probably help that too. But as far as I'm concerned on your strings, here's some other points that you might want to consider. If you're just playing by yourself and you don't really care, well then probably your lighter strings is going to be the easiest thing on your fingers. But in terms of, like especially for mandolins, the heavier strings will stay in tune better, they'll give you a lot more volume, and you probably won't break as many of them either. So the little heavier string, then of course your instrument has to be able to handle the heavier string. Now on guitars, I don't think I've ever recommended heavy strings. I would say medium strings that would be about what you want to go with on your guitars. And the medium string, I would say the heaviest is about a 56 on the high end, and the heaviest on the thin strings would be around a 12, something like that. So, you know, that gives you some kind of a ballpark area to play with. But a lot of the real good pickers like the lighter strings too, so that's okay too. You really have to kind of match it to your instrument. And okay, moving on from strings. Well, actually it still has to do with strings, but now we're going to be talking about playability and action. Well, as a general rule of thumb, now these are my general rules of thumb, okay? I made them up myself, so if you disagree with them, I fully understand that you could disagree. But as a general rule of thumb, like on an instrument like this that has an adjustable bridge, and this could be on a guitar, or it could be on a violin, it could be on a mandolin. As a general rule of thumb, you want to have the action as low as you can get it up here and as high as you can stand to play it back here. Now, when I say stand to play it, that doesn't mean that you can still play it. You can play it no matter how high it is. But I mean to play it with reasonable comfort, but yet leave it as high as you can. Now, why do I say that? Well, the reason is that height puts additional pressure down on your top, which transfers into more vibration into your top wood, and you know that just going to make that wood vibrate that much more, so you're going to get that much more woody sound, but it also gives you a lot more volume. So it's a general rule of thumb, okay? I mean, you can take anything. Now this is my other rule of thumb. There's a diminishing point of return on everything. At some point, if you get it too high, then it's going to start to sound like you're playing in a barrel, and you don't want that either, obviously. Remember that Paul Reed Smith his theory is subtractive theory. It's already as good as it can be built. I mean, the instrument's built, so you don't want to do things that take away from where the instrument is. So in other words, you can go higher and higher and higher, and then all of a sudden you're getting a diminishing point of return. You're going the other way. So at some point, you've got to realize where it's the most effective. Okay, so that's just a general rule of thumb. As low as you can get it here, as high as you can play it back here, and play it comfortably and play it well, of course. Regarding the nut and the saddle, we'll kind of talk about them both at the same time. The material you use is very subtractive. For instance, the cheapest plastic, if you will, obviously isn't going to vibrate as well and transfer the sound, is what we're talking about, into the top wood so that it can vibrate. So a cheap plastic is going to be on the low scale, and maybe, and I'm going to jump way up here and go to fossilized ivory, which I don't really care for either, and I'll tell you why. Fossilized ivory would be at the far end of the other scale, so it's much harder and it's going to vibrate pretty well. Okay. What do I actually recommend? I recommend a good bone saddle, a good bone nut, or deer antler. Deer antler, in my opinion, is even just a hair better. And the reason is because it's just a hair harder than average bone. You know, if you think about it, deer fight with their antlers. It's got to be pretty tough bone, you know, so it's a little bit tougher bone. I like deer antler a lot. I've been using it for over 30 years, and I personally have not found anything better at all for both the nut and the saddle. Now, I mentioned I don't really care for fossilized ivory. Well, ivory's fine, but fossilized, by definition, if it truly is fossilized, then it's stone. Now, you know, I think there's a lot of hype in all this stuff. There's a ton of hype in it. And what you see as fossilized ivory, a lot of times it's just ivory. It may have been found on a beach and it's real old or whatever, but fossilized, if it truly is fossilized, it's stone. Well, stone is too hard. I'm sorry. You can try it, but it's too hard. It's too harsh. Same way with like aluminum. You know, some people use aluminum or brass or whatever for a saddle. I'm sorry, but I think you went past the diminishing point of return, in my opinion. It's just too harsh, you know. So what you're looking for is something that's going to transfer the sound, not dampen the sound, get it into that top and let it spread out. Now, what else could you do about the saddle here to help spread it out? On a guitar especially, you know, you can put a longer saddle in your guitar. That'll help transfer the sound across the top of the guitar just a little bit better. Now, I mentioned the nut. Here's another thing about the nut, okay? Now, I know I'm going to get a lot of interference on this part. I'm not a huge fan of changing the nut too much. Now, here's why. You know, bear with me for a second. If you've got money to spend and only a limited amount of money to spend it down here. This is where the rubber meets the road, right down here. If you only have a limited amount of money to spend, don't spend it up here. Because I'm not saying it doesn't help, or, you know, everything you do to the instrument can help or hinder. It can add or subtract less, if you will. Sure, a bone saddle up here is going to subtract less, but down here it's going to subtract a whole lot less. It's going to add more, if you prefer to think of it as adding. You're going to get a lot more for your money down here than you will up here. One of the main reasons is when you're noting the strings, this isn't even a factor. You know, nothing's happening up here, because when you're noting it, it's only between the fret and the bridge and saddle. When you're playing it open, then this does come into play. But, you know, just so you understand where I'm coming from, I'm not saying don't change this. I'm just saying spend your money down here. This is where it matters. Okay, in terms of tail pieces, on instruments that have tail pieces, and tuning keys and things like that. We can talk about kind of both of them at the same time. Heavier in general, and of course there could be a diminishing point of return on this also, but heavier, more solid, gives you more sustain. A heavier peg head, thus like heavier tuning keys and a heavier tailpiece, is going to give your instrument more sustain. It's kind of like a bell that you would ring. A good solid handle will let that bell ring really good. You get a loose handle on there and it's not going to do much. You know, it's going to change the way that bell works. And it's kind of the same way here. If you get a really good solid tailpiece, a really good solid peg head going on up here, then that lets everything in between do its thing and vibrate. Okay? So that's just a general rule of thumb again. You know, you kind of have to experiment on that. Tuning keys, while we're on the subject of tuning keys, this is a little bit of a side note in terms of making your instrument sound better, but you know, everything that you do has some effects. So many people, I've heard it for years. I've been doing this over 30 years, as I said, and you know, I've heard forever, these things won't stay in tune. They don't work. Well, they work for me when I try it. I don't have any problem with them. You know, what it is, a lot of times, folks, is people don't pay attention to how they're using their tuning keys. Yeah, I know some of you aren't going to believe this, but it's true. If you don't always, you have to always tune up to the note. You absolutely never tune down to the note. If you go past the note you want, you don't tune back down to it. In other words, tune down below it and then tune back up just to it. Never tune down to your note. That's when your tuning keys don't work anymore. There is backlash in your tuning keys, in the worm gears and the other gears, and when you're tuning forward, you've taken that backlash out. And when you're tuning up, you're taking the backlash out. The moment you start to tune down, you've introduced the backlash. And the string will eventually pull that backlash out, and that's why you think your tuning keys aren't working. So always tune up to the note. That's a black and white fact, and I know most all the professionals know that already, but there's a lot of people that don't know that. While we're on the subject of that, and going back to strings a little bit, and again, with the subtractive theory, things that will take away from your sound, that is, you notice on mine, there is absolutely nothing left up here. I cut them off flush with the top. You leave, I'm not kidding you, I truly have seen people make designs, literally, with the extra string that's left over, and I've seen them actually make what looks like a sculpture. They'll curl them up and they'll make them all kinds of fancy looking designs up there. I'm telling you, that is definitely subtracting from your sound. Randy Schardiger's video talked about leaving tuners and different things on here, and it changes how your instrument can vibrate because you're adding things up here that shouldn't be there. Well, I'm here to tell you for a black and white fact, leaving all that extra string up there is going to create sympathetic tones. In other words, you hit a note down here, and one of those strings, or maybe several of those strings, will vibrate to that note or that tone down here, and it just creates a buzz that, it just creates more trouble. So don't create problems for yourself. Cut your strings off nice and flush with the top of your tuning keys here, so that there's not anything extra that can vibrate. Instruments have lots of sympathetic notes going on. They just do it on their own, period. So, like if you've ever watched a tuner, you hit a note like that, and you'll see the tuner vary from, at first it's perfect, but then, as it sustains, you'll start to see that note float on a lot of instruments. Well, that's what you call sympathetic overtones or sympathetic notes that are bleeding through that instrument. So you want to cut all that out, and don't leave a lot of extra garbage hanging on your instrument. Okay, let's talk about something as simple as your pick. Okay, your pick can either add or subtract. Well, I'm kind of with Paul Reed Smith. Nothing really adds. I know that may be a stretch for some of you, but I really do agree with Paul Reed Smith. Nothing really adds to your instrument. Your instrument's already your instrument. All you can do from that point on is subtract from how good that instrument can be. And you can subtract a lot by using the wrong pick. It just depends on what you're doing too. So I'm not telling you this is the only option, but your heavier picks are going to give you a little bit better quality sound in general, especially on a mandolin. The type of material is probably even more important. If you listen to this pick, it's got a nice crisp sound. I don't know if that's coming across the camera, obviously, but you get a soft plastic pick and you don't hear hardly anything. And so you want to get a good crisp sound. Obviously, tortoiseshell is an awesome sounding pick. I don't know that it's even legal anymore. I don't check into these things, so it may or may not be legal. I don't know. But tortoiseshell is very good. Some of the more newer plastics are really good. I do know that like those blue chip picks, I think they're kind of a brown plastic. Those are pretty darn good picks. They last a long time. They've got a real good sound. They're very expensive, But you do kind of get what you pay for in terms of picks. And so you want to experiment around with that. And believe it or not, the pick can make a lot of difference. You can hear a lot of extra pick noise with some picks that you don't hear with other picks. So again, it's just that subtractive theory. You have to experiment around. I personally, from my mandolins, I like a very good pick is a Tortex pick. I think it's a good material. This particular pick is made by, I've just started trying this out. It's made by Snark. It's the same one that make those little tuners. And it's a very good hard material, very good hard material, and it gives you a good sound. I'm pretty happy with the sound that I'm getting out of this. Okay, what else can we talk about in terms of how can you make your instrument sound better? In terms of holding your instrument, I think Randy probably touched on this too. When I teach mandolin to students, one of the basics is how to hold the instrument. I don't say put it flat against you like this for sure, because that's going to cause a lot of dampening in the back here. It can't vibrate if you're holding it flat against you. So I always teach people to hold it at a quarter angle away from you like this, a comfortable quarter angle away, so that only the back corner of the instrument's really against your body. It gives it the best chance to vibrate. The same way about resting your arm on the top, like for your instance on your guitar. Obviously, if you rest your arm on your top, it's going to take away from the vibration that the top can do. Same way with resting it on your saddle here or your bridge or whatever. You want to make as little contact physically other than the pick than you can. So the least amount of contact you can make with your body, the better off you are in terms of holding the instrument. There's some school of thought about setting your instruments in front of speakers and getting them to vibrate. And I have a funny story on this. I think I've told it in one of my other videos. I'll try to give you a real synopsis of this. I personally believe that, having the instrument vibrate in front of a speaker or whatever is probably not a bad thing. I mean, it keeps the wood moving, and that kind of helps work some of those little fine resins out of the pores of the wood and that kind of thing. So it's probably not a bad thing. I'm sure we could all, at least all the professional musicians out there, I'm sure you can relate to if you've left your instrument in the case for about a month and you pick it up, you think, man, this thing's not sounding so good. You have to kind of wake it back up again. You have to get it vibrating again. It might take it an hour or two, and then it starts to come back around and you can hear the difference in the sound. Well, so sitting it in front of a speaker or something like that and letting it vibrate, I'm not saying it's going to change the world, but it probably won't hurt anything either. But the funny story on that is that I was playing a show out in Dodge City, Kansas one night. It was pitch black dark. And we just got off stage, and we were out in this dark parking lot. This man ran up to me and says, "Sir, I've been told that you can fix anything on an instrument." And I said, "Well, I don't know if I can fix anything, but I've repaired a lot of instruments in my day." And he says, "Well, this belonged to my dad." He says, "It's in really, really bad shape." He says, "I'd like for you to take it back to your shop and fix it." Well, it was so dark out there wasn't any point in me trying to see it because I'm night blind to begin with. So I said, "Well, listen, I'll just put it in the car here and we'll take it back." And, so 2 or 3 days went by, and I opened up the case, and I had wished like crazy I had not taken this instrument home with me, because I have never, not one time in my life, ever seen an instrument in this bad a shape. Every square inch on the top, every square inch on the back was broke. I mean broke. It would have breaks across the grain. It would have breaks with the grain. I've never seen an instrument so shredded in my life. It was still together in one piece, but I couldn't figure out how. So I look inside, it had a round sound hole. I look inside, and he had taken a giant economy size gallon bottle of glue, poured it in there, and then done this. I look inside with a mirror, and I can see that he's glued a piece of paneling up inside the instrument, just literally paneling that would come off your wall. And he's also glued a piece of baby bed rail about 8 or 9 inches long up in there. I've never seen anything like it. So I call him back. I said, "Mister," I said, "I'm really sorry I took this instrument." I said, "There's no point in me trying to fix this." Now, this was an old J50, I think. I'm not really sure about the number. I'm not the expert on numbers and things like that, model numbers and things. I just fix them. I don't study them. But anyway, it was an old Gibson guitar from the late 50s or middle 50s, I'd say, something like that. One that wouldn't be worth a lot of money if it would have been in good shape, So I said, "I can't fix this. I'm just going to ship it back to you." I said, "To be honest with you, you might as well throw it in a dumpster as far as I'm concerned." "Well, I'm not making this up." The man started crying. Well, to make a long story short, I said, "Listen, I'll fix it if you tell me what you did to this." And he said, oh, I don't really want to tell you that. I said, well, if you don't tell me, I'm not going to fix it, because there's, I've just never seen anything that's so messed up, and I got to know how it got in this shape. He said, well, you know that theory about setting your instrument in front of a speaker and it vibrating and it would make it sound better? And I said, yeah, I've heard that. And I said, I'm sure that didn't do this. And he goes, no, that didn't do this. He says, but we were all drunked up one night, and he said, my friends talked me into putting a firecracker in there. He said that would make it, vibrate a lot more. He said, well, I thought about that for a while, and I thought that'd be a good idea. He said, instead of just one firecracker, I thought it'd be better if I put the whole pack in there. Well, there you go. People do some crazy things to their instruments. The bottom line is, I couldn't salvage the top on that guitar. I built him a brand new top for it, refinished the whole instrument, literally chiseled all the glue out of the inside, repaired the back and the sides, cleaned it up, put it back together, refinished it. 10 years later, he sold it for $3,500, so I guess we did okay. But anyway, that is about the vibrating of instruments, and they do go dead if you leave them sit in a case for a while. So you would help to put on some new strings, and I'll tell you another trick too that I've learned is, you can hear this one. If you've really got dead strings, hold the string down about midway on the neck, something like that, or maybe a third of the way down here. Hold it down to the neck, and then pop it really hard. I mean, I'm not doing that right here, right now on my mandolin, but on a guitar, I know it definitely works. I really haven't ever tried it on a mandolin, to be perfectly honest with you. But on a guitar that's got really dead strings, you pop it really hard, and you'll hear that string wake up. You'd be surprised how it'll wake them up. That's a good temporary fix if you need to wake up your string that's really dead. I'm not saying that that's going to work for any length of time, but it does work if you just got to get right on stage or something and play a little tune and you need to hurry up and do something. Well, that might give you a little tip right there. I hope you found this helpful. I didn't have a script, as I said. I'm just talking off the top of my head. I'm trying to think if I could think of any other ideas about making your instrument sound better. I guess the bottom line is use your common sense, do things that take away less, and you'll be doing the right thing, because you can't really add to what your instrument is your instrument. You can't really add to it so much. It's just that you can take away less, at least by Paul Reed Smith's idea. And I completely agree with him. I hope you check out his video. I think it's an awesome video. Be sure to check out Randy's channel, and also check out my buddy's channel up there in Washington, Mr. Jeff Bradshaw up there in Washington. He works on the old trucks and things. He doesn't really do too much with instruments, but I think you'll enjoy his channel as well. Till next time, I'll see you in the next video. Be sure to share this if you think it's worth sharing, and be sure to comment and like the video. I appreciate that very much. Y'all have a great day.